Well, at the moment, I think he's done his best to avoid it, to be frank. I think it dawned on him that he was playing with very serious fire. All sorts of terrible things could happen.
So recently, Douglas Macgregor went on Judge Napolitano's podcast and is talking about how Trump played with serious fire in Iran, the negative consequences despite the ceasefire, and especially the things that no one's talking about regarding this situation and how it could spiral out of control in the future. So let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Colonel, was any bona fide military purpose served by the United States of America spending $100 million to drop 30,000-pound bombs on empty tunnels in the Iranian mountains?
No, I don't think so. I think this turned out to be a training mission with live ammunition, but fortunately, no one alive on the ground where the bombs fell, and apparently nothing of consequence on the ground where the bombs fell.
Would not.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know for sure the ramifications of all that. A lot of the uranium isn't accounted for. Both the IAEA and a U.S. spokesman basically confirmed that. And if anything, this just incentivizes Iran to pursue a nuclear weapon. Who wouldn't after this? After you're backed into the corner by the Israelis and the United States that you're not now going to pursue a nuclear weapon. So this is going to backfire in a way, and Netanyahu and the neocons are continuing to call for regime change. They still will continue to call for regime change. You should see Mark Levin's Twitter right now. He's, frothing at the mouth and just despondent at the fact that this didn't go all the way full bore the way he wanted. So that's where we're at now. It doesn't seem like this strike served much of a purpose other than to try to get Trump some sort of quote unquote victory in his eyes to sell that we had ended the nuclear threat, which didn't exist in the first place, even according to U.S. intelligence, until like a day before the U.S. wanted to strike, where Tulsi Gabbard came out and said, oh, they're weeks away. It contradicted everything prior to that. And that's where we're at. So I agree with Douglas Macgregor.
Not American intel or the intel of its collaborators have been aware before the bombs fell that the tunnels were empty? Or was this a PR stunt or training mission, as you characterized it in the latter?
Well, I think it's probably in the realm of PR stunt. It'll take time for people to figure this out. In the meantime, people will say that President Trump is playing 4D chess or something like that. I think he was looking for something that he could do that would not precipitate the massive introduction of U.S. military power in the war with Iran on Israel's side, to be frank. And I think we informed the Iranians. The Iranians did not apparently take us under fire. I don't even know if they, employed their radars to track us. I have no idea. We're not being told the whole truth. But if I watched that particular news conference, and it struck me that this Air Force 4-star, who's now the new chairman, was less than entirely comfortable with everything he was saying.
Is it?
Yeah, I will give Trump credit. It does seem like he wanted to get the U.S. out of this, at least at some point. It seemed like some reason maybe prevailing after he, floated out the whole regime change thing on Truth Social that said, if Iran doesn't want to make Iran great again, why not have a regime change? It does seem to be that he came to his senses, did not go full bore with the strategy Netanyahu always wanted. And I give him some credit for that. But you know who I give even more credit for how they behaved? The Iranians. They were remarkably restrained in their reprisals. And there were reprisals in Israel. Innocents died on both sides of this mess for no reason. But their attack or their reprisal against the United States was like 12 or 13 missiles, and only one of them wasn't shot down from the U.S., and the other one, was set free, according to Trump. That was remarkably restrained, and it really countered the entire neocon narrative that they would just, if given the opportunity, wipe Israel off the map. They haven't, they didn't. They weren't going to attack the United States and risk drawing us into a deeper conflict. And this ceasefire may not hold either, but that's where we're at right now. And the Iranians completely disrupted the neocon narrative by how they responded.
Fair to use the descriptions that Secretary Hegseth did. This was brilliant. And that President Trump used. It resulted in, he said this as recently as this morning, After the New York Times reported that people in the military were saying the tunnels were empty, he still said it. Totally obliterated their nuclear program.
Well, when the truth is ugly, only a lie could be beautiful. And I think that that particular lie is very appealing. And we're going to stick with it. Again, it may be in his mind a way to get out from under the demand that his donors are making that he join the war against Iran by attacking them and essentially rescuing Israel from its perilous state. That's the only thing I can come up with. It's not.
You know what? I'm going to predict this right now. In a year, everyone's saying that's, close to Trump supporter, Trump himself, Pete Hegseth, what a remarkable success this strike was on these nuclear facilities, even though I don't even think one was destroyed. And a lot of it was underground tunnels. There's indications that they moved a lot of the uranium prior to this, and I would have. This has been in the news for months that there's been antagonism toward Iran. If I was the Iranian regime, I would do that. But here's what I'm going to predict. In a year or less, you're going to have Netanyahu coming out saying they're close to a nuclear weapon again. The neocons are going to come out and say they're really close to a nuclear weapon, this time for reals. And guess what? It will prove that those, they'll disprove themselves that those strikes weren't effective. The neocons that were cheering the fact that Trump bombed them. So that's what's going to happen. This is going to be a long-term lingering problem. Israel may break the ceasefire, Iran may break the ceasefire. It seems like that's already happened to some degree on both sides. Trump wasn't exactly happy about it, but that's what's going to happen. And it's going to nullify all the celebratory mood that you saw when George W. Bush was on that aircraft carrier saying mission accomplished in the same way.
It's not going to work, Judge. These things don't work. Ultimately, they fail. Let's now see whether or not this ceasefire has any staying power.
He is keeping the United States in the war with NATO against Russia in Ukraine. Is he in danger of leading us into a new war in the Middle East?
Well, at the moment, I think he's done his best to avoid it, to be frank. I think it dawned on him that he was playing with very serious fire. All sorts of terrible things could happen. You have in the background of all of this, of course, the threat of disrupting the oil flow through the Straits of Hormuz. I think that's something he absolutely wants to avoid, even though that won't affect us immediately as profoundly as it will affect the rest of the world. It nevertheless is something to be avoided. And I think he also recognized that the president of Iran's visit to Moscow was very important, and that President Putin made it abundantly clear that he's going to support Iran. I think Putin has sent a number of important signals. And those signals, I think, probably influenced Trump as well, despite the fact that General Keane and others have said, oh, well, that's all nonsense. We've heard all this from Putin before. That's a bluff. Forget it. I think President Trump began to think it through.
Yeah, I agree with him. This is going to definitely sow the seeds of distrust toward other countries that, ostensibly the U.S. is trying to negotiate with and secure peace with, including Russia and Ukraine. Putin can't be looking at this and say, oh, yeah, I think, now I trust the United States more based upon what I saw in Iran. No, the U.S. isn't trustworthy to any of our adversaries that we're fighting in a war. It's not a hot war. It's a proxy war, but it's still a war with a nuclear power, the biggest armed nuclear power in terms of total number of warheads. So that's going on. And he's totally right about Trump playing with fire, too. And Trump played with fire to such an extent that, we're pretty lucky that the Iranians showed such restraint against the U.S. vessels. Now, they didn't want to do that to draw us into the war, but let's say they truly felt like this was going to happen, a regime change was imminent, there's going to be an invasion. I do think they would have struck us. And to roll the dice like that, like Trump did, was truly playing with fire. It never had to happen to make this point, of which, it doesn't seem to have solved anything. If anything, if I'm the Iranian regime, all I'm doing is trying to acquire a nuke now. So the U.S. won't do this to me. Just like the U.S. doesn't try to do this to North Korea.
I know, Jack, and I've stopped listening to them. The two Jacks, Devine and Keene, they're just in another world on all of this. I haven't spoken to Jack Keene about this, but he was ecstatic over the drone attacks on the four Russian military bases. By what authority can the United States of America destroy a lawful, internationally examined, and approved enrichment activity in a sovereign country?
Well, it presupposes that there's a body of international law that the United States of America actually respects. I don't see much evidence that there is.
Yeah, it's there, but it's not respected. LBJ himself signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty for the United States, but nobody respects international law.
Yeah, I think there are some people out there who try to, but it's like everything else. When you put the name international in front of it, somebody has to enforce it. Who's going to do that? That's the problem with the United Nations. It's a good idea, well intended, but no one is going to enforce anything.
Yeah, I'll go further than that. I don't think it's that good of an idea. Globalism on any scale, and Mearsheimer talks about this quite a bit too, is that in a system of foreign policy where there's many foreign actors acting within their own interests, they're going to act in ways that are anarchic to each other. They're essentially anarchist in a way because their foreign policy dealings doesn't have like a higher level overseer that has much authority or power whatsoever. We saw this during the Iraq War. The UN condemned the Iraq War, said, it was completely illegal, violated everything, and yet the US went through with it regardless. And then we got a 20-year occupation. There was nothing to stop the US from doing that. Same thing holds here. And, I happen to agree with some people that believe that, international consensus leads them to believe that the U.S. shouldn't involve itself more overseas militarily. But I believe that not for that reason. I believe that because it's America first. It's actually America only not to do that. We always suffer negative consequences from that. And it doesn't take international consensus or an international body or international law to lead me to that point. That's where I differ with Sachs. But point well taken. He's totally right about this.
I think President Trump is also very concerned about the state of affairs in Israel. No doubt he was told that the Israelis are on the verge of running out of missiles. Their economy is not just in ruins, it's going to collapse. This man Smotrich, who's one of the more fierce advocates for mass murder in Gaza and elsewhere, actually spoke publicly and said, we've got maybe a week left. And now nobody in Israel will admit that. Nobody, certainly at the top. And then finally, there's also the other possibility that nobody really has come to terms with right now. And that is that the potential for Israel to become extinct as a state and a society through mass emigration. People are leaving and more people are likely to leave, in which case, the 9 million man state of 2 million Arabs and 7 million Jews will consist of 2 million Arabs and substantially fewer Jews. So I think Israel is in trouble. And the notion that somehow or another they hold the high ground and hold all the cards is a little ridiculous.
Yeah, I haven't really studied the demographic trends like Macgregor apparently has here. I will say Israel hasn't exactly done much to avoid getting more enemies in the Middle East. They've invaded or annexed or laid claim to about 5 or 6 different countries in the last decade and, invaded several of them in the last time. Look at what they're doing to Gaza. It's about the most, criminal, ghastly thing imaginable right now. And all international eyes were on that prior to this war. Now I think they will go back to that if this ceasefire holds. So yeah, Macgregor's right.
Is it true that the Israeli government is attempting to prevent people from leaving?
Oh, yes. There's no doubt about that. I've had people tell me that point blank who sent me notes about it from Israel itself.
Do you think that the so-called ceasefire, and I don't mean to demean it, but if it's not in writing, who knows what they agreed to? And as far as I know, there is no writing. Whatever President Trump announced before was requested by the Iranians or by Netanyahu crying uncle?
I think the Iranians have been advised by Putin and Lavrov to exercise restraint if possible. And if the opportunity presents itself to participate in something that will slow or halt the destruction, that they should do so. The Iranians, however, were not begging for a ceasefire. That's nonsense. But the Israelis very definitely needed one. Now, how long will this last? How rapidly can we replenish what they've fired? Somebody said to me late last night, the Israelis have probably fired off in terms of missiles in 2 weeks what will take 2 years to reconstitute.
Not sure if I 100% agree with him on this one. I think it's likely that the Israelis believe that they are in trouble only if regime change was never truly on the table. And I actually think it was on the table if Iran would have acted bellicose and actually sent many missile strikes to do damage to U.S. forces in that region, then it truly would have been on the table. But if the Israelis realize that, then yeah, I think they would have wanted a ceasefire. I also agree. I do agree with him on the point that I think that Lavrov and Putin were advising the Iranians not to provoke a greater war. They're a BRICS ally. And I halfway agree with them on that.
In other words, they haven't got enough left to defend themselves. And you've got 2 missiles have to be fired in response to every 1 missile coming in. The Iranians, on the other hand, as an Israeli official, I think it was Gavir, mentioned about a week or 5 or 6 days ago, we completely underestimated the Iranian missile arsenal. They did. And the Iranians have been very straightforward and said that, we'll stay in this as long as it's required. So I think, the Israelis may have 2 more weeks, 3 more weeks before they're completely run out. And they needed a break.
Well, they need the U.S. to bankroll them, apparently. And, this is the situation that really calls out U.S. support to Israel in general, because there's no way Israel would have done this strike on Iran if not for the U.S. subsidizing its offense. And notice I didn't say subsidize its defense, because this was a provocative, aggressive strike, a preemptive strike, an actual non-provoked strike. Unlike Putin's invasion of Russia, this was actually unprovoked. So that's where we're at, and it really calls into question the close relationship between Israel and the United States, which shouldn't be. In a good America First world, where that's the actual solution and the actual creed, there wouldn't be any support for Israel at all.
What damage has Netanyahu done to himself?
It's too soon to tell, but, I think we and Netanyahu have done damage to ourselves. I don't think anybody beyond the borders of the United States believe anything we say, Judge. We have broken our word. We have deliberately misled and lied to not just the Iranians, but to others. I don't think anybody in Moscow or Beijing, or for that matter, anywhere else listens. I know that the Koreans and Japanese have both backed out of the most recent conference invitations. I think they view us as unstable and dangerous. Again, I think I mentioned this some time ago. The rest of the world sort of looks at us as patient zero, and they want to contain us. They want us to stay in our room. They don't want to go to war with us. That's the great myth. I think it was Jeffrey Sachs who said more than one occasion, never in our history have we been more safe from attack than we are today. That's true, except for our soft underbelly in Mexico and the drug cartels and the millions of illegals in the country, but no one external to the country wants to go to war with us. And as I've heard repeatedly from my friends in Korea over and over and over again, the only people that are talking about going to war in Asia are the Americans. Nobody else in Asia is interested in it. Nobody is interested in going to war with China, and they utterly reject the notion that China is a military threat to them. So, we've reached this strange point where President Trump is doing what most presidents do. He's taking, credit for what looks like a short-term positive development, and he might as well, because presidents, when they're in office, are always blamed for anything that goes wrong on their watch anyway.
Yeah, this scenario unfolded in a way that was not nearly the worst case, and for that, I am so thankful that U.S. troops didn't die. There were people that did die needlessly, innocent Israelis and Iranians, and I'm going to talk about them both, not just one side, because war is always destructive, and the human element that this affects is not insignificant. Now, what he said about disrespect around the world is totally right. The rest of the world does look upon the United States as a dangerous entity. Why wouldn't they? And this doesn't help. And it goes beyond that, though, because not only do they view the United States as dangerous, including world powers we might want to negotiate with, including Russia, like we're doing right now, apparently, they have seen what happened. And what happened in this situation is the U.S. telegraphed and set a precedent for violating its own foreign policy aims to negotiate with the Iranians to help the Israelis do whatever they wanted. The Israeli policy prevailed over the United States policy. And Trump was in on it, at least at some point, because the delegation switched from no nuclear weapons to no nuclear enrichment, which is a non-starter. It was never going to happen. So that's what the rest of the world sees. And it's a duplicitous entity that negotiates in bad faith. That's what it sees.
Do we know the nature and extent of the damage to Israel? I know the IDF and the Netanyahu government are laboring mightily to keep that from coming out. But can we piece it together from what your friends have told you?
Well, I think you got to look at the satellite photography. You got to talk to people that are at least on the periphery of the intelligence collection system, and they paint a pretty grim picture. Now, is every building and every house in Haifa or Tel Aviv being destroyed? Not yet. No. Could they be? Absolutely. And that's the problem. I think the Israelis have figured out that this is a war they cannot win, which is why Mr. Netanyahu has been so determined to drag us in. We were supposed to go in and win this for Israel. President Trump has betrayed his donors, apparently, and Mr. Netanyahu, at least insofar as he's been unwilling to take us directly into the war. Now, you can argue, as I have, that we've effectively started a war with Iran. But Iran thus far, since no one was killed and the targets that we attacked were irrelevant, has scrupulously avoided giving us an excuse to go to war against them. And I think that's what happened with the attack on the airfield and the installations in Qatar, where we had already evacuated everyone. And they did what we did for them. They let us know that it was coming. Now, there are a lot of people who are misinterpreting events right now. They're saying, oh, well, now all the Emirates will flock into our arms. They all hate Iran and so forth. There's a problem in the region that we don't get, and that is that everyone in the region hates Israel. That's the problem. Whatever goodwill there might have been, it's gone. Now, what about the elites in the Emirates or Saudi Arabia? They are increasingly isolated from their populations. The populations are the ones who are enraged over Gaza, and they're angry that nothing has been done about it. You have a similar development, not as dangerous, but it's serious, in Turkey, or Turkey, as they want us to call it now. The Turks are furious with what's happened in Gaza and the absolute failure of the Muslim world, with the exception of Iran in their estimation, to do anything about it. We keep focusing exclusively on Iran. Iran is not the only issue here by any stretch of the imagination. This is a regional-wide hate fest now against Israel. And the Israelis are saying, well, they always hate us, not on the scale that they do now.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there are some changes, though. I mean, Syria was allowing some of the Israeli strikes to use their airspace, from what I understand, and Egypt doesn't go to war with Israel anymore. That's because they're being paid off by the U.S. That's another ramification of USA to Israel. Well, to placate Egypt, who was always at the throat of Israel in the 60s and 70s, we just give them, I think, $3 billion a year on top of all of our aid to Israel. I also want to touch upon what he said earlier. I think he was totally right when he talked about how Israel's gambit was to rely on the U.S. coming in and bailing them out. And by bailing them out, I mean doing the regime change. That's what Netanyahu wanted. Thankfully, Trump, the better angels of his nature, prevailed. And we haven't gotten that, and there's not indications that we're going to get that anytime soon if this ceasefire holds. Now, it might not hold. It's been violated by both sides now. Again, like I said, Trump seemed very upset, not only about the Iranians, but about the Israelis violating it. Does that mean he's upset at Netanyahu? No. You know, people are going to talk about that. Oh, look, Trump actually is, disturbed by the actions of the Israelis in this regard. He's not. He would just have to threaten to withdraw aid if he truly was. He's not going to rebuke all the Zionists in his cabinet that, are there because they're Zionists, approved by Miriam Adelson. So, yeah, I think that Macgregor was good on that topic.
Absolutely, Frank.
What is the danger to President al-Sisi in Egypt and the King of Jordan presiding over populations that profoundly and overwhelmingly and massively disagree with government policy towards Israel?
Well, I think King Abdullah is very much at risk of being removed, and I think he knows that. And he is surrounded by very powerful security forces. And I think that they've been very lucky thus far that nothing has happened to him, because he's seen, frankly, as a stooge for Israel. He didn't start out that way, but that's the way he's viewed at the moment. Sisi is in a somewhat different position. He has moved forces to the border with Israel. People are angry that nothing has been done. But as I think I mentioned earlier, Sisi is worried about the consequences for Israel, for his own country. Number one, the Israelis have always privately, quietly threatened Israel with the use of a low-yield nuclear weapon that could
You mean
strike
threatened
the
Egypt?
Afghan.
You meant to say threatened Egypt.
Yeah, threatened Egypt. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Right.
Because of that Aswan Dam, and that could have terrible consequences for the state. The other problem is that they see us as unconditionally supportive of the Israelis. So if the Egyptians were to attack right now, their fear is that they wouldn't simply contend with the Israelis. In fact, today, Israel is weaker on the ground than it's ever been. They're afraid of what U.S. air power would do in support of Israel. Then they don't necessarily want to be in that fight. Now, Egypt and Iran are close. Egypt and Russia are close. And China stands right behind Russia in connection with both countries. If something happens to unravel everything in the region and start a regional conflict that would be the end of Israel, it will start with Egypt, because the Egyptians could now have a very serious impact on Israel.
They can, but again, they're being paid off by the United States not to go to war. There's many stipulations that, prevent them from doing that. Otherwise, the U.S. would withdraw aid, and that's a lot of money for Egyptians. $3 billion. Also, he kind of danced around this, but one of the ramifications of this is it has to drive the BRICS countries closer together. And especially the most consequential is Russia being driven into the arms of China. That's one of the most negative ramifications of our proxy war in Ukraine. But now we're going to see that even further. And that's not really to our advantage at all in terms of having two of the world's biggest superpowers, more antagonistic against us. Not that I think they want to start a war with the U.S. They don't. But they're driven closer together in solidarity because of the bellicose actions of the U.S. versus BRICS allies.
What do you think the Kremlin is thinking about what Trump ordered on Saturday night?
I think they're shaking their heads, trying to figure out what is driving President Trump. And I think they've decided that President Trump is impulsive, short-term in his thinking. He's looking for the so-called win that he can get out of this for himself here at home. So I think they've pretty much given up on us. Somebody said that the Russians sort of view us, and this applies to the Asians as well, I think, certainly in Northeast Asia, as the equivalent of a large-scale drug addict who has cravings, mood changes, acts on impulse that is completely unpredictable. Now, some people in this country think, well, that's a good thing, isn't it? That scares all our enemies. Well, that presupposes everybody's the enemy. I don't agree with that. And then secondly, that also leads your potential adversary to take measures against you that you may not care for and lead them to pull the trigger when you really don't want them to. I think the Russians want to avoid a conflict with us at all costs. So they're going to continue to counsel caution. But at the same time, they're moving decisively towards the river. I think they will go across that river. I think they will take Kiev and then move south to seize Odessa. I think all of that is coming. But they want to avoid a direct confrontation with us.
I don't think the Russians are going to take Kyiv. I do think there's a chance of an offensive into the southwest to take Odessa, but not Kyiv. I don't think that's even Putin's desire, to be honest. So on that, I think I may disagree with him, although the U.S. certainly has worked to, expand and escalate at certain times that war. If it had any knowledge of the drone strike that happened, which they claim that it doesn't, but supposedly that was an 18-month operation. It's hard for me to believe that no part of the CIA who provides intelligence to Ukraine or the Trump administration knew about that. Now, the thing that stuck with me that he said there that I think is super correct is when he talked about, the erratic behavior of Trump scares away all our enemies. And what he said next was so key, I think. That presupposes that everyone's our enemies, and I don't believe that. I totally agree with that. A lot of powers are not innately disgruntled at the United States to the point that they want to be our enemy. No one wants war with the United States, and even the countries that would most want war with the United States know that they're not really capable of taking the United States on, at least if it was one-on-one. So, totally agree with that. It's a bad, starting point of foreign policy where you just innately assume everyone's your enemy. I see the liberals doing that with Russia and a lot of the conservatives doing that with China. And that's a negative impulse that really drives a lot of the war propaganda that we see. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you agree with Douglas Macgregor here? Do you see any more long-term ramifications for this Iran war? What were the worst consequences and maybe the best consequences? Do you think I'm being too hard on Trump and his role in it? Let me know down below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. Please consider becoming a YouTube member or Patreon patron to support the channel, and I'd really appreciate it. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.